So hi everyone, I'm just going to start my own timer as well, just in case. I'm Zara Asif. I'm a research assistant at the Centre for Society and Mental Health based at King's College London. And today I'll be talking through a qualitative research project that looked at structural barriers to refugee, asylum seeker, and undocumented migrant healthcare access in the UK's hostile environment. So our presentation is based on a qualitative study in which we looked at the structural violence perpetuated by the UK's hostile environment policy. We looked at the barriers to access and provision of healthcare for refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented migrants. We explored how barriers to healthcare lead to worse health outcomes, and then we ended off by highlighting some of the recommendations by healthcare providers to ensure equitable access to healthcare for refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented migrants in the UK. So just for a bit of background to the UK's hostile environment and how it would be relevant to healthcare. The hostile environment policy was introduced in 2012 by the then Home Secretary Theresa May, with the aim to create a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants, essentially forcing them to leave the country voluntarily. This consisted of a number of policies and memorandum of understandings that spanned across the social, welfare, benefit, and healthcare system in the UK that would essentially restrict illegal migrants from accessing basic services. And all of these had the overall aim to create an atmosphere of fear for irregular migrants in the UK. In addition, under the hostile environment policy, and this is still going on, overseas migrants, including refuged asylum seekers and undocumented migrants, are charged upfront for secondary care, and this charge is usually around 150% of what regular British citizens with a formal status would be charged. Upfront charges as such result in delay in access and provision of treatment, leading to worse health outcomes. And this picture here, I just thought I would add it because I'm sure a lot of you have already seen this, but this picture is of Theresa May's Go Home vans. And the Go Home vans were part of a very controversial 2013 advertising campaign by the British Home Office with slogans recommending that illegal immigrants should go home or face arrest. And they were sent to tour areas around London. There were 6 boroughs with high immigration populations. And the point of the operation was that people who did not have leave to remain would voluntarily depart if a threat such as being arrested was made apparent to them. So for the research, we made use of semi-structured interviews and freedom of information requests. The qualitative semi-structured interviews were conducted with caseworkers working at the charity Doctors of the World UK at their London clinic. And the freedom of information requests were made by email to 30 NHS England trusts, and the data was analysed using thematic analysis. So I mentioned earlier that the hostile environment policies create barriers for access to healthcare for refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented migrants. So some of these barriers include charging regulations, data sharing, the refusal to register patients at GP practices without proof of ID or proof of address, language barriers, and complications and confusion navigating the healthcare system with the ever-changing guidelines. Here I have a quote from one of the interviews that I did with the caseworkers, and they say, obviously, if someone has a pre-existing medical problem that they need care for, there may be a delay in access to services and to treatment. You know, there are cases where people try in a number of different surgeries and get refused a number of different times, and that delay in access can be quite significant and may deter people from trying to access care. So this kind of summarizes this barriers aspect to it quite nicely. So from barriers, so the barriers that I just mentioned, they result in risky help and health seeking. We found that this leads to existing chronic conditions being further exacerbated, pregnancy complications, and delays in treatment, which lead to more frequent A&E admissions. Often health problems such as non-communicable diseases, infectious diseases, reproductive health problems, and mental health conditions are created and worsened. So I've got a few examples. Well, I've got two examples from the interviews, and one of them highlighted that as of 2017, a normal pregnancy with no complication costs around £5,000 to £6,000 for overseas migrants. And when unable to meet these upfront costs, this can result in delays and avoidable complications. So this kind of sets out how upfront charging and charging regulations translate into health outcomes when it comes to antenatal care and pregnancies. And another example of the ways in which upfront payment can act as a deterrent and a barrier was provided by a caseworker who remembered a telephone conversation with a service user who had just fallen off a ladder and broken their wrist whilst at work, with a visible bone protruding from their broken wrist. And instead of calling an ambulance, they called the Doctors of the World advice line due to concern that a hospital visit would mean incurring large sums of money that they did not have or being reported to the Home Office. So this really shows that the additional strain that is being placed not only on the physical health, but the mental health of people trying to access care, whereas in this situation, the solution should be fairly simple in terms of going to the doctor and getting this broken wrist looked at. And again, this quote highlights the differences when it comes to availability of treatment and provision of treatment quite nicely. Letting people get to a point where they are in absolute agony before they can access a service, it just shows that they don't have a right to healthcare. Everyone is not entitled to the same level of care that everyone should receive. There are differences in who receives and who doesn't, who receives care and who doesn't. So following from this, we also asked the interviewed caseworkers for recommendations for improving healthcare access and health outcomes for refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented migrants. Caseworkers stress the importance of firstly recognizing health as a fundamental human right and improved healthcare as the basis for a better life in a new environment. To achieve this, it is important to create an empathetic health system which caters to the needs of people by acknowledging the hardships that they have faced throughout their migration journeys, allowing them to access care without restriction or fear. As well, caseworkers explained that it is also important to advocate for policy change, especially in relation to charging regulations and upfront charging, as it's quite problematic. And then to conclude, our findings suggest that government regulations and Department of Health policies deter refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented migrants from accessing the NHS. We argue that such regulations are structurally violent as to prevent vulnerable groups from accessing basic health care and achieve better health outcomes. And then lastly, healthcare is a fundamental human right. If people are not supported in claiming this right, the right itself becomes meaningless. And I'm just going to end off with two quotes from the interviewed caseworkers that I think conclude this presentation quite well. So the first one is, and then just having a bit of compassion and empathy in these situations. And I think one of the most concerning aspects of things I hear about interactions at hospitals is the communication and the language they use is very direct and one-track minded on getting the money back in very little regard to someone's situation, be that destitution or, fleeing whatever situation back home. So this really highlights that aspect of empathy and compassion and being aware to some extent of the situation and the journey that these patients have been through. And then the last quote is, I think individuals have the right to move from areas of war and violence. And so we as a country should be supporting individuals who claim asylum and the right to a better life. But we can only do that if we support them by giving access to healthcare once they are here. So yeah, that sums up my presentation. And thank you for listening, and feel free to get in touch with the details on there. And if you want to read more about this research, we've also got the link to the article. Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Brian. I am from a charity called Migrants Organize. I'm the legal organizer, and today I'm going to talk about our project called the Migrants Mental Capacity Advocacy Project and the report that we produced last year called Without Capacity, which discusses how mental capacity acts as a barrier to justice in accessing the immigration system and actually the wider welfare system. Just a bit of a background, Migrants Organize, we're a charity based in London. We do mainly two things. Under the community program, we provide ongoing holistic support for migrants and asylum seekers, mainly in Greater London area. So I myself am an immigration and welfare advisor. And then we connect the difficulties and the experience that our members faced into our wider community organizing campaigns, policy and legal work. And the Migrants Mental Capacity Advocacy Project is one of that, which I will talk about a little bit later. However, I thought I would start the presentation really with a brief overview of what exactly is mental capacity and what I mean when I talk about mental capacity. So mental capacity essentially is the ability to make a particular decision. In the UK, the Mental Capacity Act 2005 kind of is the main legislations, I would say, which covers the law when it comes to mental capacity. And it defines a person who lacks capacity if that person in relation to a matter, if at the material time, the person is unable to make a decision for himself in relation to the matter because of an impairment of or disturbance in the functioning of the mind and brain. And what does that mean? Unable to make a decision. There's a functional test. Essentially, if you can't either understand, retain, use your way, or communicate a particular decision or a specific thing that you need to do, then you can be said to lack capacity. And that inability needs to be caused by by an impairment or disturbance of the mind or brain as well. Now, the diagnostic test has actually been interpreted quite broadly, so you don't require a specific diagnosis. So someone who's kind of, under alcohol abuse, for example, can also be said to lack mental capacity, although of course mental capacity is also time specific. And I think the Mental Capacity Act was enacted largely with the care kind of context in mind. So Section 5, for example, provides protection from liability for people who make decisions or do something on behalf of someone who lacks mental capacity to do that thing if the action or decision is in connection with the care or treatment of that person. So for example, if you think about someone who is in a care home, who maybe suffers from dementia and can't decide what to wear that day, a carer can just make that decision and change the person's clothes on their behalf without, without being concerned of being sued for assault, for example. So what does this have to do with immigration and asylum process in general? I provided a couple of case studies essentially from the project, and these are based on actual cases that we're working on. So I think the theme here is basically there's just a gap in every step of the way for people who suffer from mental health issues and who might have difficulties with their mental capacity to engage with the immigration process, to actually access the immigration process and get their status sorted and get out of the hostile environment policy. So this is a case study of a woman who's from Gambia and who's been living in the UK since 2005. She has various physical and mental health issues, including HIV positive, end-stage renal failure, and I don't know whether I mentioned it there. I think she's, I can't remember what else, sorry. But basically she's been supported by local authority for a long time, and her last leave expired in 2016, and she became an overstayer because she refused to engage with the immigration process. She doesn't believe that she has any immigration issue, and when the social worker talks to her about it, she would get really upset and kind of refuse any sort of help and assistance, let alone like going to the Home Office to claim for asylum. So social services, to their credit, actually tried their best to help her to resolve her immigration status. They obtained a private immigration solicitor who again tried to advise her. She refused. They also wrote to the Home Office asking what to do in that case because they don't believe that she'll be safe returning to Gambia given her condition. but at the same time, she still has no recourse to public fund, for example. She can't apply for disability benefits and other kind of support that she requires, and everything kind of falls on social services to support her. Essentially, the Home Office just said nothing. They didn't advise on what can be done, didn't provide any reasonable adjustments to her, and didn't provide any opportunity for her to actually access the immigration system. She was then referred to us, and I actually tried again to raise this with the asylum safeguarding team. Initially, they said there's no case for her, there's no asylum case pending, so it's not within their purview. I then had a conversation with them and explained to them that that's precisely the issue, that we think she has an asylum claim, but she just can't claim asylum herself because she lacks capacity to make that decision. And after a bit of back and forth, this is kind of the last email that I actually received from them. Again, essentially, there's just no mechanism for her to access it. And it's really kind of, shouldn't be surprised at this stage, but it is really surprising, to be honest. As I imagine, there's actually quite a lot of these situations out there where people are under care of social services, for example, and just can't engage with the immigration process. The same issue we also see in the appeal context, when someone needs to kind of go to the immigration tribunal, for example, to appeal a refusal from the Home Office. I've been working with this man called EA, who was a dependent of an EA national. He made an application for permanent residency after living in the UK for 5 years in 2005, and it was refused due to a technical issue. The Home Office said that they already revoked his leave to remain in the UK, which he didn't realize, because following an accident, EA's kind of health and mental health deteriorated, and he was assessed as lacking capacity to provide instructions and to litigate. The hearing was actually adjourned for almost 3 years because the solicitor wasn't able to find anyone who could step in as a litigation friend on his behalf and litigate on his behalf. And at the same time, the hearing couldn't progress because the solicitor didn't have anyone to instruct them, and therefore it couldn't go fairly. In the meantime, his benefits all stopped, and he accrued more than £10,000 of debt in rent arrears, and his supported accommodation tried to evict him and asked him to go to a day center. So then he was referred to our project, and then we connected him with one of our litigation friend volunteers, and the hearing could progress. And then we referred him for CARAC as well for assistance by social services. But until now, he's still waiting for a status because of the extended delay. They had to gather all the kind of evidence again because everything became out of date by that time. So it just adds significantly to the delay. And again, I think, we talk about accessing the Home Office itself, like either making an application or going to the court, the tribunal. At the same time, the issue of capacity kind of, it becomes a barrier actually every step of the way. If you think about how someone who is in a very vulnerable position can ask for help in the first place and explain their situation when they're street homeless, for example, like this man XC, and might have mental health issues which are undiagnosed, they might not be registered even with the GP because of all the issues that were just mentioned previously. They might not be connected to the community mental health team. People from the community mental health team might not understand about the issue of immigration or assessing capacity when it comes to immigration. So there's literally kind of no medical evidence to support the adjustments that the person needs. In the case of XC, for example, he was merits filled multiple times by different charities in London, because it's not their fault either, I would say, because he has difficulties with his communication essentially, and it's really difficult to get any instructions from him in terms of his immigration background. He would just say he arrives in 2001, becomes homeless, and then he wants to stay in the UK, and then nothing else. So it's hard to kind of find an avenue for him to actually get a leave to remain here. But we've worked with XC now for 3 years and really kind of took our time to build the relationship with him and take his instructions. And turns out he was a victim of trafficking essentially, and that's how he come to the UK. So now we're referring him to the NRM. But it took a lot of effort and a lot of kind of consistency, which is really difficult, and which the charity sector usually doesn't have resources to do. Sorry, how am I doing with time?
It's just up.
Okay, great.
We can
Well,
conclude
I
that.
think that's all I want to discuss, to be honest, like mainly the case studies. We've obviously established this project to kind of look into these issues and try to kind of build best practice on how to assist, and you can read more about it in the report, which I've asked Nathan to circulate.
I'm going to just present my study on participatory research into the mental health impact of the asylum process with migrants in the UK. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Birmingham. I'm also a psychiatrist and drama therapist. So this was a question that was supposed to come up on Mentimeter. I don't know if anybody's able to access it now, and obviously we've only got maybe half a minute to look at it, but I did want to focus on ethics. So what are some of the ethical issues prior to and during collaborative or participatory research with migrants? Yeah, so if you do have your Mentimeter up, please just pop your answers in there. So on to the next slide. I'll just read it out from my computer. It says, the pressure, my God, you come into this country and you're hoping for the best. People seeing you are going to Great Britain. You expect everything to be great, wonderful, nice. You come to be rescued from the strings and tangling of poverty. And when you come, you find that there are so many obstacles. You're going to get stressed out. You're going to get into depression. So why participatory research, or in fact, why any research about mental health and well-being with migrants? Participatory research in particular tries to center the lived experience of migrants and uplift their voices. But also a really important question that we're facing at the moment is how are we addressing the trauma and long-term impact of the hostile environment and asylum process, and the increasingly complex experiences migrants are subjected to. So next slide, please. Action research attempts, so that you might know different types of participatory research. And some of these are attempt to redress and reframe power relations. Obviously, throughout, we've got to think about ethical engagement and also our personal positioning. In my case, that was my role as an academic facilitator and a co-researcher. So here, I'm just going to put these two slides just on for 1 minute, but just the theoretical basis. There are so many incredible people who have built up the knowledge base around participatory research, both in terms of epistemologies, but also in terms of practical like ways, methodologies of actually doing the research, and also bringing together research, methodology, and action. So in terms of Paulo Freire, what would be termed as praxis, yeah, and all the other great people who are listed here. Yes, another list of key theorists who you can look up in your own time if you don't already know them. But a couple there are decolonial theorists who also very much around centering global South voices. So what were we trying to achieve? So there's both in the process, so with participatory research, you've both got the process and of course you have the outcomes. So as part of the process, we're trying to achieve this creative and welcoming space for people to share their experiences and research together, the discussion of sensitive topics to create a trauma-informed safe space, to research together. And this is an opportunity to leverage academic funding and power to uplift people's voices and democratize knowledge and center lived experience. So in terms of outcomes, the outcomes are essentially emergent, bringing the group together, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then seeing what will happen and what the group achieve. Some of the outcomes that they did think about were archiving their experiences, passing on knowledge and their experience to help and support others, long-term collaborative relationships, and they were in the process of developing an online timeline charting the asylum process and mental health stressors along the way. So really important, move at the speed of trust. This is a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown. And I think this is a central feature of any research, particularly participatory research. So focusing on critical connections, creating trust and relationships. So this research was over 16 weeks. We were 9 co-researchers with 1 volunteer co-researcher from the Migrant Center. And the first 4 weeks were spent thinking about what are we going to research and creating the research questions. And we also developed a code of conduct together, thinking about the ethical issues and the difficulties that might come along the way. And as I said, it was emergent. So these were the list of our questions, which I'm not going to read them all out, but they essentially, most of them center obviously around the understanding of mental health, defining the group and our purpose, and the impact of the Home Office and asylum process on mental and physical ill health. It just shows some of the process. So here is just us thinking about the process. Yep, the next one is kind of thinking around the timeline. So here you can see that people were inputting some elements of the asylum process, have gone through some of the stressors, and then some of the disorders. And then in the next couple of slides, you can see how they created some ways of expressing this. So this one shows the journey again. You can see the journey on one side, and then you can see the different kind of stress and emotions that people suffered along the journey, different disorders and their different supports. And then the following slide shows the same kind of thing. And people spoke about their stress, their fear, their worries, the sadness, all of these things, and some of them related to disorders. And this slide was put together as part of a presentation by the co-researchers. Here we discussed loss, and there you can see how loss was felt in so many different ways: financial, relationships, physical, legal, emotional, and obviously time central was to that. So people lose their family, time wasting. The asylum process is wasting people's time. I've been thinking I will come and carry on with my career. I couldn't do anything, whatever. I end up doing something else. The time is gone. I lost my children. I lost my husband. Time is gone. Age is not really on my side anymore. When I'm in the classroom, I'm still struggling to become somebody in my life. But when you think of the loss, you can't do anything. You become useless in society. So that was Aku, who was a co-researcher in our group, who had to wait some 15 years before she was able to get her asylum status. What I will say is that there was, in our particular group, not many people related to the word trauma. And then they put together this slide as well around suggestions for coping with mental health. So there's lots of different things they put there, such as God, attending groups, going to support places, exercise. And then the next few slides are around just ethical issues, which I just want to end on. So I think we'll skip the analysis, although there are some really interesting findings, but we'll just skip that. We will say this quote. There was, just going back to that quote about colonial system and just thinking about Maya's keynote speech today, I think that this quote is very short, but has so much in it. So one of our participants, when they were speaking about why people end up in this country, said the colonial system has been so deeply embedded in people. And then, yeah, just the final slides on ethics, just to take away really that when you're designing participatory or collaborative work with communities that have suffered violence, suffered displacement, suffered loss, just bearing in mind there are so many different ethical issues to think about, ensuring that knowledge is not extractive, that power dynamics are thought about the length of the relationship, the research relationship. University ethics can be quite difficult to navigate in participatory work, so just thinking about that. So just further information. So just there have been there's so much more work around this and doing safe and ethical participatory work. So here are some ideas of where to go to, and there's some codes of conduct which you can look into. So thank you very much.
I have some questions. One of them is for Zara, related to the FOI component of your research. So the question goes, what was the FOI component of your research? Did you have any difficulties getting FOIs, replies from the trusts?
Yeah, thank you for that. So the essentially the FOI component of the research, the aim was to look more specifically into charging regulations and upfront payment within the NHS, and how basically what the policies, guidelines, and protocols or standard procedures that are in place to identify those who are potentially chargeable under the NHS charging regulations. So this is back in 2017. Also, what is used to identify exempt groups, and as well, because there is so much confusion between sort of status and eligibility, also to find out how they identify those with asylum applications under process, because those aren't chargeable. And then as well to identify how to basically find out or determine whether care is immediately necessary or urgent, and where the upfront charging component then comes in here. In terms of whether it was difficult or getting answer from, so when it comes to FI requests, trusts or whoever you make the request to, they are required to reply within a 21-day period, I believe. So I did get a reply back from everyone, but oftentimes the issue was that it was a very standard link to the NHS guidelines as opposed to procedures that are actually operated. And it's very inconsistent across trusts, because some trusts have sort of like a 2-pager outlining an interview and everything, whereas some just sent back a guideline. So it was a mixed response.
So we have a question for Brian. What happens when someone is deemed to lack mental capacity? What support is there for the person so that decisions are made in their best interest rather than the interest, let's say, of the Home Office? If you can expand a bit on that.
Yeah, so unfortunately at the moment, I think there's just a really lack of awareness about this issue, kind of, I would say, across the sector. So when we're talking about specifically mental capacity to make immigration decisions, it's really hard, to be honest, to get support. Even someone who's under the CARE Act, if you see the case of KDS, for example, and we have someone who's, I think it was quite surprising how much the social services have tried to help her in terms of her immigration status. That is certainly not my experience with other local authorities usually, especially when someone has no recourse to public fund. But there's kind of no guidance, for example, in terms of what needs to be done, whether an IMCA has to be appointed, where to go, and then obviously the Home Office also doesn't have a lot of policies on this. The only policy they have at the moment is in relation to the EU settlement scheme. So if you look at the EU settlement scheme, there is quite detailed policy in terms of how people with lack mental capacity can access it. And that's largely because of a legal challenge we raised last year, and it's still not perfect either. Yeah, so unfortunately, not that much. The charity sector, I guess, just steps in.
Here it says, thank you, Zara, for the interesting presentation. How do you think refugees and asylum seekers trying to access healthcare navigate the inconsistent, ever-changing guidelines?
Thank you. It is difficult because it's already difficult enough to access care, but then in terms of all these guidelines, you have to be aware that a lot of the times there are massive language barriers in place. So then to have to understand what these guidelines mean, and then, you know, they change the next year, it is quite difficult. So what we found was that a lot of refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented migrants rely quite heavily on organizations such as Doctors of the World to then, you know, explain and translate this information to them and make it simple, just so it makes sense. And then as well, I think we also found that it is quite difficult for sort of front desk staff such as receptionists and practice managers, because as the guidelines are always changing and there's so many depending on your immigration status and your legal status, it often happened that people were wrongfully charged when it came to charges for secondary care and upfront payment. And then this again goes back to adding stress onto the patients who are already in difficult, precarious situations. So it's just sort of a vicious cycle of things, and it is quite difficult.
Thank you, Zara. And one more minute for Sarah. Do you envision worsening mental health outcomes given increasing delays to asylum applications?
I think they're going to be more complex and intergenerational issues that we're going to have to deal with. Obviously, we've got more and more young children coming over, families, sometimes very dangerous journeys, as we know, that they've come across land and then by boat, and then ending up in hotels or other accommodation. And I feel that, yeah, that really has to be the impact of intergenerational trauma, well, both on the parents, both on everyone having to undertake these journeys, but also thinking about children and the way that they are experiencing this in their bodies and the amount of fear that they are absorbing and confusion in that age. So I think there's so much that needs to be done.
Thank you very much.